May I introduce this meeting? We have an address by Alexander Downer, the former Foreign Minister of Australia, which I think hopes to be a most fascinating talk.
Thanks, Xavier, very much, and let me say it's a pleasure to come back to Durham. I came here to this union to make a speech about 4 years ago, and I think it was about East Timor or something like that. It was a slightly obscure topic, but in any case, there are people in this world who are very interested in places like East Timor, so I was a bit of an expert on that at one stage in my life. And the other association I have with Durham University is more adversarial, and that is that I went to Newcastle University as an undergraduate, and I played rugby there and played for the university and used to come down here from time to time. You'll be pleased to know I have no recollection of whether we won or lost. And I also played in the university tennis team. I used to be very keen on sport at the university, and came down here for tennis matches from time to time as well. So all I can say is it's a great pleasure after many, many, many years to be back again. And in most of those years I've been in Australia, where I was born, and for nearly 12 of those years I served as Australia's Foreign Minister. I suppose the best thing for me to do is to say something about what I'd like to call perspective. I'd like you to look at things as younger people than I am, look at things in a broader and, if you like, historic perspective, and try to instill on you a sense of being relaxed and not panicking that the world is actually gradually disintegrating and coming to an end. And then say something to you about what I think the immediate, because there are many long-term challenges, but the immediate challenges we have. And then I'm very happy to deal with any questions that you may have about any issue you wish to raise with me pertaining to Australia, of course, and things you like, or even things possibly, controversially, you don't like about Australia. Don't be shy, by the way. We don't mind our country being criticised from time to time. And if you want to ask me anything about the UK as well, at the moment I'm obviously no longer the Foreign Minister of Australia. I work at King's College London, where I run the International School for Government. I'd be pretty confident you won't want to ask me any questions about that, but if they come from left field, I'll know the answers. The first thing I wanted to say to you was that I think it is really important to look at the world events that we're dealing with a sense of historic perspective. And so I'll just take recent history, and I'll be selfish enough to take the years when I was the Foreign Minister of Australia. So I came into the job in 1996, next to Australia in Papua New Guinea. Look, you would have barely thought about Papua New Guinea, but you know, all of us in our countries think about our neighbours. You think about France, we think about Papua New Guinea. Mind you, we have a better relationship with Papua New Guinea. We've never been at war with Papua New Guinea, we've never been out of war with France. There was a civil war in a part of Papua New Guinea, an island, a very big island called Bougainville. There's a population of around 200,000 people. And as I often pointed out to people, more people died in the Bougainville Civil War than died in the Troubles in Northern Ireland between 1969 and the Good Friday Agreement. But, you know, they were in Bougainville in Papua New Guinea, so there's no media there, so no focus on it. So I came to the job, and there was a civil war, if you like, on our border. I had, with my then New Zealand counterpart, to invest a huge amount of time in trying to bring that civil war to an end, which wasn't an easy task. However, I'm glad to tell you that we did it. As that was happening, as we were working to negotiate an end to a civil war in a neighbouring country, we were all hit by the Asian economic crisis. And just to put that in some perspective, another Australian neighbour is Indonesia. And Indonesia is a huge country, 240 million people. The fourth most populous country in the world, and today the third largest democracy in the world, Indonesia. People don't think about Indonesia in the UK very much. In Australia, you always think about Indonesia because it's our next door neighbour. Its economy in 1998 declined by 14%. And the country, and in a situation like that, the country went through a huge political upheaval. So we have a civil war in Bougainville, we have the political collapse of Indonesia brought about by the collapse of the Indonesian economy and the Thai economy and the Malaysian economies and so on. We're going through a state of some collapse as well. And you know, to try to put that into parallel terms, it would be like some of the economies of the European Union as your neighbours just suddenly collapsed. I mean, they didn't just decline a bit, they just collapsed. So we were confronted with an incredibly difficult set, if you like, of very local circumstances. You didn't have to go far from that event until, I mean, I'd been the foreign minister, I suppose it was 5 years actually, when 9/11 occurred. And you all know about 9/11. I mean, just looking around the room, you'd have been incredibly young. I mean, a lot of you wouldn't even remember it actually. And I mean, here was an extraordinarily dramatic event. In the case of Australia, it was you know, it was obviously first thing in the morning in New York, but it was in the evening in Australia. I was watching the Australian equivalent of Lateline when one of my staff rang me and said you should switch over from the ABC, which is the equivalent to the BBC, to CNN and have a look as a plane has flown into one of the buildings in the World Trade Center, which I duly did. This huge event, I mean, this portrayed, of course, as a great catastrophe, as a global catastrophe, the like of which we haven't seen in recent times, really. This shocking event galvanised the world in, and I think in a sense, in unpredictable ways. So we then saw, after that, the invasion of Afghanistan, the overthrow of the Taliban regime, which I must admit, call me old-fashioned, but I thought that was rather a good thing to see them disappear, and not such a good thing many years later, 20 years later, to see them come back again. I don't think their human rights records or their capacity to manage a modern economy has improved over those 20, 21 years. And then we had the Iraq War. Of course, Australia wasn't a major player in that, but this was a huge global issue, a very big issue here in this country, of course. And I mention all of these things because I want you to understand that during those years when I was the Foreign Minister of Australia, there was a tremendous amount of international upheaval and concern. And I mean, I've only just touched the surface of the issues that there were and that we had to deal with. You know, things went wrong in Cambodia, there were disasters in Zimbabwe, we tried to expel, we eventually did expel Zimbabwe from the Commonwealth, as people were plunged into deprivation and absolute poverty in Zimbabwe. There were all kinds of issues around the world. So when you look at the news now, and you think to yourself, the world is going very badly, and gosh, what sort of a future have I got? I would just remind you that this is a constant of the way the world operates. And if you really stop and reflect on it, COVID apart, and I'll come back to that, but COVID apart, we have been going through a pretty comfortable era over the last 20 or 30 years. Things have, on the whole, in the world, been going reasonably well. Living standards have never been so high. Health, it's of course deteriorated a bit recently, but health outcomes have never been so good. Life expectancy has never been so good. And although there has been, you know, there was the Arab Spring and the Second Intifada that came before the Arab Spring, and a whole series of upheavals, and the ones I've referred to, in terms of global conflict, there has been substantially less conflict in recent years than there had been in earlier decades. I mean, I just look around the room. When I was your age, when I was a student at Newcastle University, the Vietnam War was just coming to an end. This was a huge issue. I mean, obviously the UK wasn't involved in the Vietnam War, but it was a huge public issue and much fiercely debated issue at the time. So it is important to keep things into perspective. So my second point is that I think as a result of that, we have drifted into an age of complacency, an era of complacency which has started to become dangerous complacency. So where there are issues that need to be addressed, we haven't been struggling with huge and major issues, and we've overreacted to some of the issues that have been. So this isn't the forum for me to get into a debate about the way in this country we've reacted to COVID, or in my country they have reacted to COVID, which has been, as you will probably know, pretty extreme. I would regard that as an extraordinary overreaction, and in a more troubled global time, if there were more difficult security issues to deal with, then probably we would have had a better perspective of COVID and left individuals to make judgments about their own security and protected the vulnerable, you know, the people with serious comorbidities and elderly people and so on, very elderly people. But in any case, this is, I think, a function of, if you like, of the age of complacency. So what have the consequences of that been? The age of complacency has led us to downplay the importance of security, and I think that's partly a function of the Iraq War. You know, there was terrorism, there was a huge reaction to terrorism. I've mentioned 9/11, of course. In our case, in Australia, a year later we had the Bali bombings, where quite a few Brits were killed. I've forgotten how many Brits, but 180 Australians were killed in October 2002 in the Bali bombing. Huge reaction, and the world was dominated by the counter-terrorism agenda, and it's obviously been, even in relatively recent times here, an important part of and it's been a very important part of the national agenda, actually. But isn't it interesting how in recent times it started to fade? So when I say we have started to downplay security issues, that's not to gainsay the reaction there was to terrorism, in Islamic terrorism, as you might call it. But it is a very different thing from saying that we were consolidating alliances, worried about China and Russia and so on. We became complacent. And I think that is a function not just of the prosperity that we all enjoyed, but a function of the end of the Cold War. When I was a student, there was this sort of the dichotomy of capitalism versus communism, the Americans and their allies, the Western Alliance against the Soviet Union and Comecon, and you know, there were debates. So of course there were communists on campus, and I suppose there still are, really. I always say you need a bit of diversity. You can't all be rejecting communism. Some of you must surely embrace it still. But either way, you will never live to see it happen. But anyway, embrace it as much as you like. On campus, they were quite fiercely fought issues in those days. And there was a great concern about the Soviet Union and the threat of the Soviet Union and missile attacks from the Soviet Union and so on. So after the end of the Cold War, there was a real sense of the victory of of liberal democracy might be the best way of putting it, of the liberal democratic model, and Russia would become liberal democratic. And interestingly enough, there was for a long time a view that as China became more prosperous as a result of the post-1978 Deng Xiaoping reforms, as China became more prosperous, it would become more democratic. That really showed a complete lack of understanding of China, actually. But that was a view that many held. And that was a complacent view. A view that, you know, we've reached, as Fukuyama, Sir Francis Fukuyama wrote years and years ago, we'd reached the end of the so-called end of history, and that's a foolish expression for somebody as able as him to have used, because clearly it wasn't the end of history. And so we've woken up now and found two things which I think in security terms are a challenge for us. One of them is the steady and now quite substantial rise of China. That you now have this huge country which is you know, as you've seen throughout history, and some of you will have read Graham Allison's book, who is a professor and a professor emeritus at Harvard, will have read his book about the Thucydides trap, that you get status quo powers challenged by rising powers. You obviously had that through the latter part of the 19th century after the unification of Germany, and they challenged, Germany challenged France, Russia and Great Britain as the status quo powers. And you know, we all know what happened then. And this is a pattern of history. I think it's true. I think it is a pattern of history. And so now you have the rise of China with a very, very different political system, and a country which says, well, the Western world made, of course with the Russians, made the global system after the Second World War. And China was not particularly involved in that. This is really, in particular, an Anglo-American world, and we want to change it to benefit China, not just have a status quo which benefits the United States and the UK and European countries and Western countries. So their ambition is, if you like, to change the status quo, and this has obviously been very substantially resisted. They don't have the same concept of the importance of the rule of international law that we largely have. Sometimes we cut corners on that one, as you know. But I mean, essentially, if we cut corners, we're much criticised for doing it. We believe in it, the rule of international law, the so-called rules-based international system. They want to see that change. And in parts of the world, particularly in the South China Sea, they've been changing the status quo through the use of force, which obviously is very dangerous. So one of the great challenges we now have to face is, how do we manage this rise of China? What do we want to achieve? We want a constructive relationship with China. After all, it's a great place to sell stuff, and they're big investors. They made a lot of money, so they can create a lot of jobs in our country, and they're important to our supply chains. Maybe too important, but they're important to our supply chains. You know that from the equipment needed to counter COVID, not least masks and lateral flow tests and so on. They all seem to be made in China as far as I can make out. So we need to have a constructive relationship with China, and we want to embrace China in the international system. On the other hand, we don't want a China that becomes so aggressive that it starts to try to change, or continues to try to change, the international status quo through the use of force. And that includes through, if you like, economic force and economic bullying. So how do we deal with that? Well, I think we have not been dealing with it, and in recent times started, perhaps over the last 4 or 5 years, started to wake up and to think, yes, well, there's more to this rise of China than just flogging them a lot of stuff. I mean, in your case here in the UK, selling a lot of Bentleys and Rolls Royces, Range Rovers, things like that. In Australia's case, iron ore and coal, dare I mention it, they have a lot of coal-fired power stations in China, as you know, and all sorts of other essentially raw materials and foodstuffs. So, I mean, 30% of Australia's exports go to China, so that is a huge advantage, I suppose you could say, but a huge vulnerability for Australia as well. So how do we deal with this? And the answer to that lies in the lessons of the 19th century. There are some bad lessons in the 19th century, but there are some good lessons. After 1815, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, there was relative stability for a long time in Europe because Europe maintained a balance of power. And that is what we need to try to do in dealing with China. So all sorts of ways are now developing of maintaining that balance of power. So the liberal democracies in the Indo-Pacific region are increasingly coming together and working together. You've seen the evolution of something called the Quad, which is India, Japan, Australia and the United States. I mean, it has various manifestations, naval exercises, meetings to discuss the security environment of the region and exchanges of technology and so on. Quite a lot of facets to it. But the important thing about it is the, if you like, the symbol of it. Japan, it's what, the third biggest economy in the world, 130 million people. So not one of the most populous countries, well not so populous when compared to China, it's what, 10% of China's population. But India, with a massive population but of course a relatively small economy, but a growing one, but a relatively small one, countries like that working with the United States, the great guarantor, if you like, of that balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region, and Australia, which is a capable country, 12th biggest economy in the world, but has a very substantial navy. More recently, there's been what's called the Orcas Agreement, the Australia-UK-US Agreement. This brings Britain into play and is a function of a number of things coming together at once. I mean, first of all, what I've been talking about, the importance of the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region, and the UK deciding in the context of leaving the EU to change the balance of its foreign policy and to have this so-called tilt to the Indo-Pacific and getting engaged with the challenges of the Indo-Pacific. Does that make sense or doesn't it make sense? That's a very interesting debate. I'd probably be a bit biased here in one respect and say that I think it does make sense if you assume that the centre of global economic gravity is going to move away from Europe away from possibly the transatlantic region, but certainly away from Europe towards Asia. And I think, you will see substantial growth in India, and it also has a massive population. The countries like Japan, Korea, Indonesia, the Southeast Asian countries, Malaysia, Singapore and so on, Vietnam, these countries are all going to become economically increasingly important in the years ahead. So it makes sense for the UK to engage more with that part of the world. And this does represent a very, very big change, not articulated in the media of course, but a very big change in British foreign policy. So I told you at the beginning, for 12 years I was the Australian Foreign Minister, in nearly 12 years, 3 months short of 12 years. In that time there wasn't a single visit to Australia by a British Foreign Secretary, which is an incredible thing. And it was 17 years between visits to Australia by British Foreign Secretaries when William Hague came to Australia in about 2012 as the 2012 as the relatively new Foreign Secretary in the coalition government. That was because the Foreign Office, the FCO, as it then was, and British governments basically thought British foreign policy was about engagement with Europe and building the European Union, you know, ever closer union and all of that. You know, some of you will think that was a great thing. Being young people, young people at university, statistically, most of you will think that that might be wrong, but statistically, most of you will think that was a great thing. But you know, and whether it was or whether it wasn't, leaving the European Union meant that that vision didn't really make any sense anymore. And so you have the UK now playing into some of this Indo-Pacific architecture, if you like, and most importantly through this Orcas Australia-UK-US agreement. What's that about? It's an agreement to exchange highest level technology between those countries. And that includes exchanging with Australia nuclear propulsion, not weapons, but propulsion technology for submarines. But it also means exchanging technology on things like, in a military sense, artificial intelligence, cyber, and so on. So the list goes on. So, you know, in a modern sense, because after all, the wars of the future are going to be AI and cyber and they're going to be a huge technological challenge should those wars ever happen. They may not, of course, but this is an important arrangement for the substance of it. But I think, speaking to a British audience here, it's an important arrangement in terms of the UK's engagement with what I was talking about, and that is that balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region. Am I optimistic about it? Yes, this can work. And this, if you like, formal and informal alliance of liberal democracies around the world, this recognition of their commitment to the rules-based international system, the values that liberal democracy brings, which I don't need to articulate to you, this recognition that these are huge bonds between them, and countries which are autocracies that have disregard for international norms of human rights, countries that want to change the status quo through the use of force, are to be resisted. We are to say to these countries, we're happy to collaborate with you and cooperate with you, but you are not to break international law in some sort of violent way and change the status quo. So I suppose that brings me to the issue du jour, which is the Russian build-up on the border with Ukraine. I would say to you, you know, the British government and the NATO governments and President Biden's, well, his staff anyway, but President Biden, you know what I mean, President Biden has messaged to the Russians that there won't be war, but there will be huge consequences for Russia if it invades Ukraine. I actually think that Russia wouldn't risk it, and they'll probably invade in the middle of the night tonight, but then I'll be on the train back tomorrow morning, so, you know, I'll be out of here. But I mean, I think it is incredibly unlikely that they would invade Ukraine, and I actually don't think President Putin, contrary to what Joe Biden and his team say, I don't think they, well, the British government says, I don't think they have had any real intention of invading Ukraine. After all, although the Russian army could militarily take Ukraine, it couldn't really hold it for very long. And the consequences for the Russian economy would be crippling body bags back in Moscow. And I think the political consequences for President Putin would be very negative from that. But what Russia is about is Russia's historic position of maintaining, at the very least, neutral countries, if not allies, along their border. Because Russia doesn't have natural borders, does it? It has a history of being invaded by the West, And you can dismiss that, you can say it's absurd to think that lovely countries like ours would ever think of invading Russia, but hang on, we have. And in the Second World War, okay, we didn't invade Russia in the Second World War, but they were invaded in the Second World War, and they lost 20 million people. I mean, I don't know Durham really very well, apart from the rugby grounds and the tennis courts here at the university, but walk around Durham and there are war memorials. But, you know, how many Brits died in the First and Second World Wars compared to Russians? And yet it's a big thing in our society here, isn't it? The memories of war and the stories of war and the commemorations and so on. But for Russia, 20 million people in the Second World War, it's a huge issue for them. And they are very distrustful of the West. And of course, Hitler wasn't the first Westerner to invade them. So that is what they're about. And President Putin, I mean, Russia is a fading power. Its economy is about the same, its GDP is about the same size as Australia's. You know, Russia can't throw a huge amount of weight around, but that is, as the Russians would see it, and President Putin does see it, is a sort of an existential issue. So they don't want Ukraine to become part of the Western Alliance, part of NATO. They don't want Ukraine into the European Union, and if they can just stop that happening, then I think, you know, they will be happy, and I assume that in any case would not happen, because I think that would be a casus belli actually, if Ukraine were to, I mean, who knows where it would go. That such a war would be a complete disaster really, including ultimately for Russia. You know, I think you've got cause to be optimistic. There won't be a war between Russia and Ukraine. The balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region, carefully managed. We'll all have our fights with the Chinese, but that wolf warrior diplomacy of China, that incredible burst of aggression we saw from the Chinese in their diplomacy over the last few years, will fade, I think. Do we have any other problems to worry about? Well, you will worry about climate change. But that, of course, is a very long-term issue, anyway, we're sort of gradually and very slowly addressing those issues, and I think you could make a very constructive argument that we aren't addressing them much, but that just brings me to what I think might be a real worry for us. So shall I leave you with a worry? I've been making you, I'm not making you feel so much better. You're all going to leave here really bouncy. Not so fast, not so fast. I think the overreaction to COVID around the world, which, you know, closing economies, has had to be compensated by governments. They've had to do it. If they have to close their economies, well, they have to look after people. The huge increase in government spending, so since March 2020, I think it's about $11 trillion worth of increase in government spending. Quantitative easing by central banks. I have argued for a long time, look, what lessons of history have we now forgotten? That's going to be inflationary. And if you start inflation that way, you've added to it, by the way, by saying, well, we must, I'm not saying this is wrong, I'm just making you think about it. We must get out of hydrocarbons. How can we meet net zero by 2050 if we're going to continue to extract gas, oil, coal, and going to drive our economies on that sort of energy? That's right. That's quite a good argument. That's quite a convincing argument. So in the last 2 years, there's, you forget what the government tells you. In the last 2 years, there's been a 40% decline in global investment in gas. So it's not just a question of the Russians or the Chinese doing something nefarious and, you know, it's not our fault, officer. Actually, it is, because we have been going around saying we should not be investing in gas. It's finished. gas is a transition fuel, we don't really agree with that. We don't think it should be a transition fuel, we shouldn't invest in gas. That's fine if you're really rich and you live in Belgravia, and as your gas price rockets up, I live in Kensington actually, well honestly, let's be honest, who cares about the increase in gas prices? I think as I climb into my lovely warm bed, the little heater on there, against the wall, it's all very nice. Yeah, sure, but if you're a pensioner, living in Gateshead, how about that? That's quite good, isn't it? Gateshead. Old Durham Road, I remember, I used to live there once. If you're living in Gateshead, that might be a real struggle for you. When you see your gas price increasing by 25 or 50, you know all this. And this is partly because the supply of gas is now declining. So I leave you with this thought. President Biden, have you got the impression I don't think the world of him? President Biden, I mean, I like consistency in politicians. I like to know that they believe in something and they will argue for what they believe in, and sometimes I will agree with their arguments. Even if I don't, I admire their determination. President Biden went to the COP26 conference in Glasgow, all self-righteous about how America was going to spend trillions of dollars on decarbonising the American economy and so on and so forth. But he sat down while he was there with the leader of the United Arab Emirates and pleaded with him, and this is in Glasgow, pleaded with him to increase oil production because the price of petrol, and gas as they say in America, was going up. Well, hang on, that's the idea, isn't it? You push up the price of all these things and price them out of the market. Then we go and use windmills and, various electric cars and, all sorts of other renewables and so on. That's the idea, that's the plan. So my only point is huge expenditure on renewables to make them competitive. Yes, but the money has to come from somewhere. On top of the $11 trillion and the quantitative easing, and this is going to cause not only a lot of inflation, and I think inflation is going to get worse, but I listened to the debates here. The governor of the Bank of England says, wage restraint, but employers mustn't agree to substantial wage increases. The Prime Minister, who I do not think has a PhD in economics, the Prime Minister says the governor of the Bank of England is wrong. There should be wage increases to compensate for inflation. Fine, that sounds just completely logical, except, oh hang on, if there are wage increases then that will push up prices more, and then you get into an inflationary cycle, interest rates go up, you can see that happening already, to try to constrain inflation, and you're back into stagflation that we saw in the 1970s. Honestly, I tell you, that's what's going to happen. And so you will see unemployment rise. You'll see property prices come down. That will be very good for you. Property prices will come down. But I think we are heading for a period of very substantial economic upheaval. And I think out of that economic upheaval will be quite a lot of political uncertainty as well. Whatever you think about parties in Downing Street, and I think something different from the rest of you. You think it's absolutely appalling that the Prime Minister and his staff would behave in that way when they had made all those rules. And I just think that they've demonstrated how stupid the rules were in the first place. Mind you, maybe they shouldn't have made the rules in the first place. That's another thing that I think. But, be that as it may, that is a tiny issue compared to the really serious economic issues that I think we're going to face. But it's okay. It's okay. The great thing about a recession is that it pushes down CO2 emissions. and if I were, the Doom Goblin, as he's sometimes called, and I was running or gluing myself to the road or whatever it is, I would think that would be just great. Who cares about a recession? Who cares what gas prices are? Who cares? I mean, it's right. The trouble is, the punters do care. And I think that there's going to be a very difficult period ahead of us. Sorry to be so pessimistic, but there won't be war in Ukraine, and I don't think we'll go for war with China, and I don't think China will invade Taiwan. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I would just like to thank Mr. Downer for the most engaging, amusing and extremely thorough. And do we have any questions? Dylan? Oh, sorry, I should say... Sorry? Whichever you prefer. Entirely down to you. But also, just of course, give your name and college for minutes, and then you can, of course, get your invitation to the evening of the later for a drink.
John, I think you know who I am.
No one else does.
Obviously, we've seen Australia and New Zealand both lock their borders for 2 years. How have those decisions, by, let's say, before 2019, we thought two fairly centre-left, centre-right, fairly mainstream governments, nothing too controversial about either of them. How is that going to affect their international standing and our trust in them as international partners over the next 10 years, when we know they can just hibernate themselves for 2 years, just unlike anyone else, just because they feel like it?
Well, I think it's a hostile but a good question. And I rather agree with the leitmotif of the question, actually. But the good news is you won't remember it in 10 years. New Zealand is slightly different, but not very different. The Australian government decided it would try the federal government. So remember, Australia has a federal system. It would try to keep COVID out of Australia by closing its international borders. Then the state governments decided that they would try to eliminate COVID. They had a zero COVID strategy within their individual states. So they closed the borders of their states, and Melbourne had, I think I've got this right, 262 days of lockdown on 6 separate occasions, a total of 262 days of lockdown, which was a longer period of lockdown than any other city in the world. Buenos Aires came in a close second. No, honestly, if you're beating Buenos Aires for stupidity, that really is. How many of you are Argentinians here? It's a lovely place, Buenos Aires, by the way. You know, the grass grows up through the pavement over there. Not in Melbourne. But my point is, this was because Australia, the Australian state premiers, some of them are Labour, and in Australia the Conservatives are called the Liberals, some of them are Liberal. This is not really a party political issue. They decided they would pursue a zero COVID strategy and impose huge pain on the country through endless lockdowns. And of course, it's been a complete failure. There are 25 million people in Australia. There have now been about 2.7 million cases of COVID in Australia. It's just everywhere. So it's been a complete failure. They also joined in that absurd campaign against AstraZeneca. I saw one of the scientists who developed the AstraZeneca vaccine came out and said today that the politicians who had gone around bagging AstraZeneca in Europe, well, that's a particular reference to President Macron, had cost 100,000 lives. Well, you know, people just make up the data these days, who would know? But the point is, in Australia, some of the governments, the state governments, were going around bagging out AstraZeneca and saying, well, it's going to cause you blood clots and the like. So people weren't getting vaccinated. The governments were closing the borders. And then, you know, you can't keep it out. Eventually it's a virus. Eventually it will come in. And it has, and It's just spread everywhere now. So the whole thing is a catastrophe. And ditto with New Zealand. Well, New Zealand is even worse. You get 2 cases of COVID in New Zealand, and the New Zealand Prime Minister, who used to be very popular and quite rightly isn't anymore, a British Foreign Secretary some time ago, still involved in politics, this guy. Her name is Jacinda Ardern, described her as the jacaranda. And, you know, I can see the point that she has just closed down the whole country. I mean, even New Zealanders can't get back to New Zealand. There's been an amazing story of a New Zealander who got pregnant in Afghanistan, and she went to Qatar. She's not married, right? And she went to Qatar, and it's a criminal offence to be pregnant in Qatar if you're not married to someone. A harsh law, that one. Harsh, I say. And so she said, well, in that case, I'm a New Zealander. I'd like to go back to New Zealand and have my baby. And Jacinda Ardern said, well, she couldn't, because New Zealanders can't go to New Zealand, because she might bring COVID into New Zealand. And so she went back to Afghanistan to have the baby. That she said, well, I'm going to have my baby in Afghanistan, let the Taliban deliver the baby. Yeah, well, I think in the end, by the way, the New Zealand government caved in the face of public outrage. But look, I spent a bit of time telling you that because I think it's been completely absurd. Which countries have handled this the best? This country has done an exceptionally good job. And I think you know it's all relative. I think it has done a good job. And Sweden. Sweden. That's my country. They've done a great job over there. So, that's my answer. You'll forget about it in 10 years.
Felix.
I'm interested by your...
Name and college, please.
Sorry, Felix Howe, Hatfield College. So, you spent no time all in Russia, and although they are a declining power, I'm interested in the balance of power. So, Russia is. So, yesterday we've seen Macron. We've seen President Macron going to. He's having a meeting Putin to go and discuss Russia's security issues, and it's making them comfortable with that. It's part of the reason why they are building up troops in northern Ukraine is our security issues.
Yep.
Now, although Russia is declining power, it is still going to be able to do in terms of European security and European conflict. So, what do you think the response should be in order to Russia and how to manage Russian aggression and so forth?
So remember, Russia has I mean, you can say gas. I'll come back to gas, but Russia has, in my view, one thing going for it. It has one USP, I suppose, and that is its military, which is very powerful. But its economy is not powerful. And do they have much leverage on gas? Well, of course, they could cut gas supplies off to Europe or reduce gas supplies to Europe. But what will happen then? They won't get any money. And their economy is already weak. So that is problematic for them. Can they divert gas from pipelines? You know, in time, they can divert more of their gas to China. But by the way, from the gas fields of Russia to China, that is a very, very, very long way. So I mean, my only point is nothing's impossible, but it's extremely difficult for them to do. So their USP is their military, and so they will use their military in ways that we, I don't think, would dare, that they use their military to make some points and make diplomatic points. So the second thing I'd say is here is a view I hold which is very unusual, and that is that I actually think the decision after the collapse of the Soviet Union to expand NATO was a mistake, because I think that showed a misapprehension, a misunderstanding of Russia. I mentioned earlier in my speech about Russia's history. I mean, they don't have natural defences. They've been invaded over and over again. The Swedes, the Lithuanians, Napoleon, Hitler, and you know, the Kaiser. They've they come across the plains through, that's right, through Poland, through Ukraine, and they have a crack at Moscow and St. Petersburg or Leningrad. So, you know, they remember these things. And so, as a Russian friend said to me the other day, NATO was established to deter the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed, and the response of NATO wasn't, you know, I wouldn't have been in favour of dismantling NATO. I think that would have been a huge, well, history was shown, a huge mistake. But NATO's response, the West's response to the collapse of the Soviet Union was to expand NATO to Russia's borders. And that was incredibly provocative. So when President Putin says, I mean, we just laugh at these people, you know, it's just such a huge mistake to laugh at them. These leaders do understand their countries, give them that much credit. President Putin says that, I mean, this is so untrue, this, but he says that the greatest disaster of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Well, that is complete crap, let's face it. Things like the Holocaust, the rise of fascism and Nazis, and there had to be a lot. Well, Stalin wasn't so friendly either. Mao Zedong, these people, he did a lot of mass murder, those guys. These were all great disasters of the 20th century. But anyway, he says that because what he means is Russia becomes virtually defenseless. And we made that, okay, paranoia, because we're not going to invade Russia. That paranoia, we made it worse. And so we now have a situation where he's taken Crimea, you know, bits and pieces of the eastern part, the sort of Russian-speaking part of Ukraine. There are all sorts of arguments about Russia's special relationship with Ukraine and how the Byzantine Empire came up into Kiev and created Kiev, and the Rus, as in Russia, the Rus, the Rom people. That's what those of you, plenty of you know all this. The Byzantines were known as the Roms, the Rus. So, you know, there's all that history of Ukraine and Russia, Orthodox Christianity from Constantinople up through Ukraine into Russia. So there's all of that perception that they have. And then they see, well, is Ukraine going to go into the European Union or into NATO? For God's sake, that's terrifying. We will be so vulnerable if that happens. We can't allow that to happen. So I suppose it won't happen. I suppose in the end, you know, you ought to be going and telling President Putin that we're going to decide to veto Ukraine's membership of NATO because he's put a lot of tanks on the border. But I suppose that's what we will do. Anyway, that's how I see it. A bit different from a lot of analysis, I accept that. I mean, what the governments here and in Washington do is say, he's going to invade, he's going to invade. And like he's some sort of crazy man who just wants to invade Ukraine because, well, you know, it's the granary, used to be described as the granary of Europe, so maybe he'll get some grain there, or, you know, what does he want to invade Ukraine for? Oh, to build his status. It's just bullshit.
Any more questions?
Samuel Ryan, Hill College. As a person who has a great deal of family members in Sydney and New South Wales, I was just wondering, what is your opinion, holistically, on Gladys Berejiklian's premiership? And do you think
Gladys Berejiklian?
Yeah, on the whole, so do you think it's been a successful affair?
I think she was an incredibly successful premier. She did, you know, a very steady job in New South Wales. Of all of the 6 states and 2 territories of Australia, reacted the most sanely and in the most balanced way to the COVID crisis. They were much more steady and much more rational, their government, than the other states. And it was, for me, I mean, I was appalled at the circumstances in which she was born, which she decided to to resign as a result of the Independent Commission Against Corruption investigating her boyfriend or a former boyfriend, and you know, text messages between the two of them, love notes and things are all being displayed in this as a sort of kangaroo court. It's not a proper court. And you know, people's reputations are just trashed there before they're charged or convicted through the normal legal processes. So, I mean, I think that it was the Liberal Party that set up ICAC in the first place. It was Nick Greiner. It was really badly set up. And they've been in government now for whatever it is, 12 years, and they haven't, for the Labour Party before them, they suffered a bit from ICAC as well. The Liberals have not improved the processes and introduced concept of natural justice into ICAC, and you know, Gladys came a cropper. I'm very sorry about it. I mean, I don't know her very well, but I know her quite well, and she's a lovely person. I found her a very charming woman.
John Chan, Stevenson College. So you mentioned about the balance of power and about the international rules, but one of the arguments China make against these sort of rules is they didn't take part in making those rules, and they're determined to change the rules. But how much confrontation as we in the West can afford, and so not to prevent any sort of effective cooperation with the Chinese state?
Well, they are. It is largely true they weren't involved in making those rules. I mean, actually, in truth, the rules were made by the British and the Americans at the end of the Second World War. I mean, the Russians were there, and China on the UN Security Council was represented by Taiwan, of course, not by Beijing. So they have a point. They have a point. And my point is, I accept that you weren't involved. You know, I say to the Chinese, I accept you weren't involved in making the rules. And maybe the rules can be adjusted, or laws can be changed. I mean, nobody in this room was involved in making most of the laws of this country either. That doesn't mean you can, by the way, that doesn't mean you can disregard them. Wherever you may work, that doesn't mean you can disregard the laws of this country. And same with China. I mean, you can campaign to change the laws. You can work to change the laws. China is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. China is the second biggest economy in the world. China can use its much greater heft to move towards changing some of these rules and, if you like, laws. I mean, there's no problem with that. I have no problem with that. But the changes that take place must be made legitimately and according to due process, not made by the use of force. I mean, we had a 20th century where we saw the consequences of trying to change the world through the use of force, and we saw where that led, so let's not go down that path again. That would be my message to Beijing, and I think it has been my message to them.
Brendan Jones, Josephine Butler College. What do you see as the future of the British monarchy in Australia?
Well, today is a good day to ask that. Is it yesterday? It's yesterday. It's yesterday, wasn't it? The 6th. Today's the 7th, I think. So 70 years. I think, you know, for as long as the Queen is alive, it's regarded as bad taste to talk any longer about the Republic in Australia. And when Charles accedes to the throne, there'll be a new debate about it in Australia, I think. But you see, the trouble is for the Republican movement. The trouble is that if you remove the monarchy, what do you replace it with, and how do you replace it? So you will have a president instead of the Queen. Well, the Queen doesn't actually rule over Australia, funnily enough. The Governor-General is in effect the head of state. The Governor-General, the Queen only, under the Australian Constitution, in Australian law, the Queen only has one power. She has no power to dismiss the government, to dissolve the Parliament, to appoint ministers. She has none of those powers, which she has all of those powers here, so-called reserved powers. She has none of those powers. the Queen has just one power in Australia, and that is to appoint the Governor-General. And of course, you know, you could think that's important. The Governor-General is in effect appointed by the Prime Minister. So and there's a sort of understanding that you wouldn't appoint any longer, we have done historically, but you wouldn't appoint a political person as the Governor-General. So we decide we'll have a president, and well, maybe we just continue with that. We just have the Prime Minister appoint the president. What? The Prime Minister appoint the president of the country? I don't think so. I don't think we're going to have that one, are we? No, people wouldn't vote for that. Well, then why don't we elect? Because, you know, we're the punters. Why don't we decide who the president's going to be? Well, the trouble with that is it gives the president a democratic mandate and diminishes the democratic mandate of the members of parliament. And so people worry about that. They worry, gosh, I don't know. And the more people think about it, the more they think, oh, I don't know. Do we really want to bother with this? I mean, what difference does it make? The Governor-General is in effect the head of state. And the Queen or King Charles, I mean, they just make an occasional visit. The Queen, of course, won't come again, but Prince Charles has lived in Australia, went to school there for a while. You know, he will come occasionally. He'll come about 3 more times in his life, I suppose. Bring Queen Camilla. So won't that be exciting? You know, when the Queen, the present Queen, first went to Australia after she became the Queen, that was in 1954. How about this? Sydney's population in 1954, Sydney has about 5 million people now. Sydney's population in 1954 was 1.7 million. And 1 million of those 1.7 million people turned out to see the Queen. How about that? This is incredible. And during her royal tour in 1954, she was in Australia for about 55 days. 70% of the population actually physically saw the Queen. So, you know, they were just mad on the Queen. Well, it wouldn't happen now, and with King Charles, I don't think so, mon ami. I don't think so. It's different. But I think it's hard to say. There will be another attempt. The last poll, though, depends how you interpret the figures in the polls a bit, actually. I was arguing this with someone the other day. It had only 38% of people supporting a Republic in Australia. So it depends how the issue's handled.
Secretary Richardson Hatfield College. I'm wondering if you're aware of the proposal for a Cancer Alliance and whether you think that's ever likely to happen.
So the idea of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, you know, the not American English-speaking countries, the Anglo-speaking, all getting together. They are all together in a lot of different ways. There's the Five Eyes arrangements, which includes the Americans, which is a sort of informal but very important, don't underestimate it, very important intelligence sharing arrangement. You know, I mean, I'm doing some work on border force here at the moment, and I can't remember when it is, I think it's in 2 weeks' time. There's a so-called B5 meeting, which is the border force, the heads of the border forces of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK and the US are all getting together to have, you know, to compare what they're doing and exchange technology in particular. This happens the whole time amongst those countries. So the only other thing to say is, well, would there be free movement between those countries? Well, a country like Australia would say no to that, because you have 67 million people here, and we have 25 million, and let's be honest, let's level with each other. you have free movement to Australia, you would all move to Australia. So we would have about 80 million people in Australia, up from 25 million, almost overnight. So, but I mean, you would get a movement of people to Australia, and you might get some movement here, like me, of course, standing here before you. But generally speaking, I think, no, I think that won't happen. We would allow that to happen. But the free trade agreement between Australia and the UK, that has provided for much easier movement. So people under 35, that's you, by the way, under 35, you, when you graduate, or even before you graduate, you can go to currently, I think you should finish your studies. You can go to Australia for 3 years and work there. So it's quite a good arrangement. So there are all sorts of arrangements like that which have become much more liberal. There'll be freer movement of professionals, architects and lawyers and so on, mutual recognition of qualifications. The medical profession, much easier movement between the two countries, because you know your NHS is obviously a slightly desperate sort of a show. And I know you love it, no, it's no, there's not criticising. I was criticising it the other day, some woman, she turned on me and said, you go back to Australia, you get out of my country. And I think a lot of you would agree with that. However, when my wife waited for 90 minutes just to get the phone answered at the surgery down the road, I was thinking maybe the Australian health system had something to commend it. Anyway, Australian doctors and nurses and British doctors and nurses will be able to go to each other's countries much more easily. So we're sort of getting there.
Yeah. Feeling England Catholic College. I've got a question about China actually, and I'm going to use Australia as a pretext. So Australia was one of the first countries to sort of really embrace China as it opened up and trade with it. Over time, that's meant that Australia is very much dependent on China economically, and what a lot of allegations are now is that China's used that to their own advantage. So they've planted spies and partners and Australian equivalent of it, and used espionage to influence politics and the education and sort of put pressure on foreign policy. How, you mentioned building a constructive relationship. How do you balance building of that relationship with a country which quite clearly doesn't really have regards to your friendliness and actually uses it to its own unfair advantage?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've been through a very tough period. So when I was the Foreign Minister, we were building our relationship with China. I've often pointed out when I became the Foreign Minister, the People's Republic of China was our 6th biggest trading partner. By the time I finished as the Foreign Minister, it was our largest trading partner. Of course, I mean, I hate to say this really, because, you know, I think self-deprecating humour is incredibly unattractive, but I had nothing to do with that. That was because of the way the market worked. And yeah, your question is entirely right. We've become increasingly dependent on China's market. On the other hand, they have become increasingly dependent on supplies from Australia. So 70% of China's iron ore comes from Australia. That means that even though they're furious with Australia because we called for an international inquiry into the causes of the COVID outbreak, they can't afford to stop importing iron ore. And I think last year, in dollar terms, our exports to China reached a new record. Even though they stopped buying Australian coal and pushed up their energy prices, of course, massively as a result of that, and had blackouts and the like. So they started importing Australian coal because politically that was a bit problematic for them. So, and I tell you all of that because there's some vulnerabilities on their side as well. I mean, I've been very concerned about the aggression, Chinese aggression. But I assume, because I'm forever the optimist, I assume that within the Chinese system people will realise that realise that this sort of aggression that they've been showing, including towards Australia, will lead nowhere good for them. So, you know, it's a good saying. This is worth remembering, this saying. It's certainly not me who coined it. China has no allies. It only has clients. And I mean, I think that's right. And I think, you know, they've lost a lot of sympathy. They've lost a lot of soft power. They've lost a lot of public support throughout the world. I mean, in Asia, it's Chinese aggression which has led to the development of the Quad and Orcas, and brought countries like Indonesia, a liberal democracy, more into the sort of American orbit. They frighten people through their aggression. I might be wrong, but I think they might be slowly waking up. They need to start working on trying to win people over. Otherwise, you know, they'll just gang up together. I mean, China may be the second biggest economy in the world, but it's a drop in the ocean compared to the combined weight of all of the Western economies in the world. Remember that. You know, put the European Union together with the UK and the United States and Canada and Australia and Japan and South Korea and so on. That's a mighty big economy compared to China. Worth thinking about that.
I think, given the time, we'll just take two more questions. Should we go with Jack and then yourself?
Thank you very much. Jack Morgan, Great College. Thank you for the talk. Despite my accent, I am an Australian citizen, and I just wanted to focus on what you're saying in regards to sort of domestic security at the start of your speech. So in 2019, the ABC was raided by Federal State Police over the disclosure of war crimes by the Australian Army in Afghanistan, looking into the prosecution of journalists. And only last year, the Identify and Disrupt Bill was passed, which created 3 new types of warrants, particularly secret warrants that deal with the manipulation and deletion of files from computers, and also the taking over of accounts used by Australian citizens. So the first part of the question is, do you believe that our civil liberties are under threat in Australia? And the second part would relate to, of course, it'd be remiss not to deal with civil liberties more broadly in Australia, particularly when it comes to asylum seekers. I understand the issue has somewhat decayed over the past few years, but particularly in the early 2010s, I have vivid memories of being arriving by boats and the treatment of those refugees, if we discuss if they can claim asylum or not, but particularly just by a blanket ban saying you can either stay on an offshore detention camp or you can leave and take up residence in a third country. Do you think that their civil liberties are also under threat and that there's a problem in Australia with not dealing with human rights in the way that other countries in, let's say, Europe might?
Well, I don't think I'd use Europe as a benchmark that way. I don't think they like to. They have a sort of line in Brussels about European values, as though it's something they've just discovered, you know, democracy. Do you know why they have that? Because it is something they've only just discovered. Good on them. I mean, I'm in favour of that. First of all, in relation to the ABC raids and so on, this is just a question of dealing with stolen documents. I mean, whatever you think about the merits of the ABC story, you should disregard that. I mean, I'm sure it's an important issue, allegations of cruelty and abuse by Australian soldiers in Afghanistan. If there are allegations, that's fine. To make those allegations in Australia, and indeed a judge, Justice Brereton, he's even a relation of mine, by the way, Justice Brereton, as you know, has done an inquiry into this, and now there's further action being taken. But stolen documents are stolen documents, so that was what the police were interested in. They weren't interested in what the documents were about. They were interested in the level of classification of the documents and the fact that they'd been stolen. Well, you know, the police independently carry out, as in the UK, the police act independently. They're not instructed by the government, as in the Metropolitan Police, and I suppose the Durham Police are not instructed by any government either. The so-called asylum seeker issue, Well, again, it's quite a simple point. I mean, it's obvious what was going on. People were trying to circumvent the Australian immigration system, and they were paying people smugglers, and they were paying them, trying to remember now because you barely get it anymore, but they were paying them sort of $15,000, quite a lot of money actually, to get to Australia by boat. It was hugely dangerous, People were drowning in the process, not to be encouraged at the best of times. And here is the decision you have to make as a government. I mean, you put yourself into a position of being a decision maker in government. Honestly, there is often no perfect answer. So either you say these people can come to Australia, and I say if that's the case, we have an open border, anyone can come to Australia who wants to come to Australia. We shouldn't be subjecting people to making journeys on dangerous little boats. We should send a ship over to Indonesia and load up the ship and bring them to Australia. I mean, if that's what we want to do. But if you want to have a controlled immigration system, then you need to do two things. One is you need to control who comes into the country in the circumstances in which they come. And secondly, you have obligations under the 1951 Refugee Convention, and you need to fulfil those obligations. But those obligations aren't to bring people into your country and settle them as citizens. Your obligation is to provide a place of protection, to give them protection from persecution and various other things in the convention. So Australia says, well, we'll give you protection, mate, but you're not coming to Australia. Not coming to Australia that way, paying a people smuggler. Instead, we'll take refugees through the UNHCR system and the IOM, the International Organisation of Migration. We'll take refugees, and we take, I think, about 20,000 a year, which would be more than the UK takes, by the way, with a population of less than half the UK. We will take refugees and we will resettle them, but we'll decide who we take from the pool of refugees offered to us by UNHCR, United Nations High Commission for Refugees. But paying a people smuggler? No, mate, that's not going to happen. They're not going to come that way. If you want to come to Australia as a refugee from a refugee camp, then go to the UNHCR and make an application that way. Otherwise, we're just going to have chaos. I know it's been tough, and I mean, some of the criticisms are, you know, it's hard to gain some of the criticisms. I've had to put up with them over many years. And it's exactly, you know, I've been talking to the Home Office about this here. I mean, you know, in the UK, they're going to have to face up to some of these hard questions in relation to the channel crossings. I mean, there were 26,000 people who came across the channel in tiny boats last year, and this year they reckon there'll be 60,000. Well, when there are 60,000, people are going to say, well, what's happened to when we have a border force, and we have borders and passports and things, why bother? And if these people are, you know, poor, suffering people, 80% of them are young men, by the way, they're poor, suffering people, and, you know, they're making this dangerous journey on a boat, well, send a ship across and bring them back, bring them all over. Why not? What's the argument against bringing them all over? You know that. So it's not easy. There's no easy way out of it. I mean, I think Australia's record on human rights is equal to any. It's probably not better than everyone's, but it's equal to any. And, you know, Australia wrestles with its own series of dilemmas. There's the Indigenous issue, you know, Indigenous disadvantage, as it's called. You know, Indigenous people in Australia are on average, obviously not all, but are on average. They have a much lower life expectancy, their living standards are much lower. And, you know, the Chinese, talking of the Chinese, whichever one asked you about the Chinese, the Chinese foreign minister said to me, well, you know, why are these Indigenous people so disadvantaged in your country? And I said, well, it's a huge issue. We spend billions of dollars every year trying to address it. And honestly, we haven't cracked it. We haven't cracked the code. Because, you know, it's a dilemma of maintaining their traditional culture on the one hand, and ensuring they have all the benefits of Western civilization like health and education and so on the other. Very difficult balance to get. I said to him, if you have any great ideas, don't hesitate to let me know, because you may come up with something we haven't thought of. So, you know, every country wrestles with these dilemmas. They are dilemmas. You know, reminds me of that BBC programme, The Moral Maze. Worth listening to that, actually. And it just explains to you how, gosh, you just wrestle with these dilemmas, and in government, you're doing it the whole time.
Just give you one final question.
Patrick Hayes, University College. I've got another Australia and COVID-related question, but as someone who still calls Australia home, I think it would be interesting to ask. So, during the pandemic, I did have the opportunity to come to Australia, and I turned on the television in my quarantine hotel in Adelaide. And
which hotel was it?
Near North Terrace, I can't remember.
What, you spent 14 days there and you can't remember? You'll be getting into it.
Anyway, I turned on all the television channels, ABC, SBS, etc. And they were all about COVID and lockdown and so on, and frankly quite depressing. What do you think? Do you think there are any kind of long-term social impacts on the Australian population, and will that have any impact on the upcoming federal election?
So I come from Adelaide, and I have a house still in Adelaide, and you'll have seen on TV Nicola Spurrier, the chief medical officer, the woman with the sort of very carefully crafted hairstyle. It's a bit sexist to say that, because if it were a man, yes, no, if a man had a carefully crafted hairstyle, we might know that you've got quite a carefully crafted I think it will have huge long-term consequences for Australia, actually. Children were kept out of school, and the children, like my grandchildren, do okay, right? Because my daughter and my son-in-law are both lawyers, so they're sort of educated middle-class people. Both did postgraduate degrees in the UK. But what about people at the other end of the socio-economic spectrum, who's for them losing all that school time, and there's a single mum, and she has to go to work because she's a nurse in a hospital, and the kids are just left at home all day on their own. What's the consequence of locking them up for 262 days? It's huge. I think it will take, it's a bit of an issue here, by the way, too. I think it will take years to overcome that. So I think, I believe in equality of opportunity, not complete equality. That, for me, is an absurdity. But equality of opportunity. And this just knocks a hole in the whole concept of equality of opportunity. It was a terrible thing to do. And people suffering from mental health problems, dislocated families, they never said goodbye to Grandpa when he died, and it's just a litany of tragic stories brought about by these policies. And then, for those of you who are economically literate, we're excluding the Prime Minister from that. Those of you who are economically literate, the cost of this. When I left government in 2007, when the Australian public very unwisely threw us out of office. Can you imagine? I wasn't able to persuade them to keep voting for us. And that, we had won 4 elections in a row, so I suppose people get tired of you in the end. They had too much of a good thing, that's what it was. So when they got rid of us, the Australian government had no net debt at all, 0 debt, and ran a budget surplus of 1.5% of GDP. And now the Australian government is running up debt, net debt, of around $1 trillion. $1 trillion. They've just gone crazy with money. I mean, this doesn't matter to people at the moment, but it's inflationary. It will just take forever to pay off. And there will be, I've talked about it, but there will be all sorts of economic consequences that will befall Australia, which had been doing so well. So, I think it's really sad. I'm very upset about it. There's elections coming up, and we all have to vote in Australia. So, I'll vote. But, you know, I'm being pretty unhappy with everybody. I mean, you know, the opposition were calling, it's not an argument to vote for the opposition, because the opposition were calling for even more stringent measures. They attacked the government, like in this country. They attacked the government for not having stringent enough measures. Well, there's no limit to these people, what they want to do. I mean, 2 world wars, and we fought for freedom, and our fathers and grandfathers and so on. We just struggled, some of them died in fighting for freedom, but when COVID came, we didn't care about freedom anymore. We chucked it overboard. Honestly, people thought about this.
That's it. Thank you very much.